When I was growing up, one of the traditions we had at Christmas, on Christmas Eve in my family, was that we would get a special personal visit from Santa Claus. I assure you, just us, we only got this special visit. Before he would come later in the night, he would give us some preliminary gifts. But anyway, in preparation for him coming, my cousins would take us upstairs to our bedroom window, and we would look out, watching for Rudolph's red nose. And then we would hear bells downstairs and know it was time he would arrive, and it was time to come and greet Santa Claus. Anyway, point being that when my older cousins would take us up and watch for Santa Claus, in order to pass the time, surely just waiting for Santa Claus, and not because for any other reason that adults were doing something else downstairs while we were upstairs. Anyway, our tradition was to sing Christmas carols, of course, while watching and waiting. So when I was young, and had these older cousins, they of course knew all the words to the Christmas carols. So, as happens, they would be teaching me the words as we sang it, and that's how I started to learn the words to Christmas carols. But given my personality, I didn't like that I had to be taught the words to Christmas carols, and apparently my brother didn't either. So as we got older, we took upon ourselves to teach ourselves all of the verses of all the Christmas carols before Christmas Eve so we could impress our cousins, until the one year when we launched into all 5 verses of Good King Wenceslas. And then I think the tradition kind of fizzled out after that. As you can imagine by that story, the music of this season means a great deal to me. And, show of hands, of all of the wonderful things about this season, Advent, preparing for Christmas, and Christmas, how many of you would put in your top 3 the music? Oh, yeah. See? I know you people. Right? There is something about, inescapably, something about this season that requires song. During this Advent season, this year anyway, and maybe always when we do Advents, we're thinking about Advent as the season when we relearn how to hope. Last week we talked about the posture of hope, how we hope with our bodies, and Jesus' teaching about when it seems like everything is absolutely falling apart and you've come to the end of any other possibilities, that's when you need to stand up and raise your head and look out at the horizon. There's a physical posture to hope. This week, we can consider, how do we speak in hope? What is the language we use? How do we use our voices for hope? In today's gospel, there is a very stark distinction and contrast made. There is, at the beginning, that long list of very important sounding people with long names and longer titles and all of the things that they are in charge of. And then there is John, son of Zechariah. There are the rulers, and then there's the Baptist. There is civilization, and then there's the wilderness. There is history, and then there's prophecy. There is, I would then say, prose, the language of rationality, the language we use to organize the world. And then there's poetry, the language of the heart, the language from our deepest selves and our deepest souls. And that poetry, and that is poetry that's being cited at the end of John's Gospel from Isaiah, comes from, as it says, or at the end of the gospel, comes from the prophet Isaiah. And the thing is, the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, almost entirely wrote in poetry. Now, I have to give you a little bit of a history lesson. I'm sorry. But those prophets that we read from so often, like Malachi, like Isaiah, like Zechariah, not the same Zechariah, Amos, all of these names that sometimes just sound like names in that first reading we read so often in church. These folks had a very particular context. They had a very particular problem that they were all writing about. They were all writing about 600 years or so before the time of Jesus, at a time when ancient Israel was completely falling apart. It had already been split into two kingdoms, and it was having internal disintegration, and foreign empires were picking off pieces of it, until finally it culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the complete erasure of all self-rule in Judea, and the exile of so many of the rulers and elites and important people of Judah to the city of Babylon in southern Iraq. The years before, during, and after, that is the entire context that we get these prophecies, that we get this poetry, this new kind of way of speaking to the people of God about what is happening and why. And the why really matters, because almost universally, the diagnosis is that the reason Israel has fallen apart, Judah has fallen apart, is a failure of social justice, a failure to care for the poor, a failure to care for the widow, a failure to care for those who are different from you. That is the judgment. And from judgment, the people then journey into despair, and only on the other side of despair to hope. And the prophets span that entire journey, judgment, despair, and hope, as if it had to happen that way to get back to hope again. And yet the entire journey, all along, the language for this is poetry. It's verse. It's song. It's language that is not appealing to the intellect, but appealing to our deepest selves. Because even though they're talking about a political and economic and social reality, the prophets realized that policies are useless without vision. Without a vision of what might be, of what could be, a vision that appeals to what we all most deeply hope for. Poetry has this way of breaking through our old patterns of thinking, of getting our imaginations to spark, of dreaming, as we talked about last week, too, of seeing possibilities that we couldn't see if we just tried to solve the problem head on. These visions appeal to the whole self, all of our senses, and our sense of transcendence. And it's the same, I think, the reason we like this music so much is that is also how Christmas carols are written. They're written in this way that transports us to a time outside of time, a place outside of history, but which transforms history when we come back from it. There's a reason, then, why Christians turned to the prophets so much when they tried to describe what difference Jesus made. It wasn't just to say, oh, the prophets predicted this, and look how he fulfills it. That's a little bit of the game they're playing, but that's not the full meaning. And if it were, we would kind of cut that out. The full meaning is to say there is some sense that we are always being disintegrated. We are always in that place of exile, like the prophets were talking about. And there is something about the coming of Jesus that restores us, that brings us through that journey of judgment, despair, and back to hope through his life and through his death. But just saying that isn't going to do anything. We have to sing it. We have to put it into poetry. And I sincerely believe that that is so much of the work of the church in this time, is to reclaim that prophetic, poetic voice that we tend to neglect because it doesn't sound serious. It sounds like make-believe. It sounds like a fantasy, and it doesn't deal with concrete problems. But it is really the only way to finally turn all of our hearts to new possibilities and awaken all of our imaginations. At the end of the day, it seems like Christmas is the one thing sometimes that we've got left that still appeals to people. You know? You ever feel that way? It's the one thing that we can really fill up the church with, where people don't come out of a sense of obligation, but they come seeking something, some sense that they felt once when they were sitting in the church on Christmas Eve and felt transported to another place. But why should that be limited to Christmas? Is there something about the way we sing at this time of year that we can continue in all of our work? Amen.